and welcome to the LINX Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Jonne Soininen and I'm the Head of Global Engagement here at LINX, and I'll be moderating today's session. So welcome to all of you watching this presentation live through the webinar, and a special welcome to you. We do want you to participate, so make sure to use the chat to talk about amongst yourselves, but also use the Q&A function to ask questions to our speaker. We like it when it's a little bit interactive, so don't be shy and pop any questions you have at any time in the Q&A, and I'll make sure to put them to today's speaker. And welcome to all of you watching it on YouTube Live afterwards as well. So the LINX Distinguished Speaker Series is a series of talks gathered here at LINX by experts in the industry who have deep knowledge and expertise and often a unique perspective on a particular subject. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jonne Soininen. Jonne is the head of open source initiatives at Nokia, based in Espoo, Finland. Prior to his position here, he worked in different positions with Nokia, Siemens Networks, Renesas Mobile and Broadcom, and has an extensive history in telecommunications and software engineering ranging over 25 years. Currently, he's serving as a governing board member of the Linux Foundation Networking, LFN, and Linux Foundation Artificial Intelligence, LFAI. Jonne has a Doctor of Science Technology from the Aalto University, Finland, from the School of Electrical Engineering on Networking, and master's degree on Computer Science from the University of Helsinki. I think he's a familiar face and a name to many of you in the IETF community, in the ICANN community, and of course in the open source community. And it is a fantastic pleasure to have him here with us today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jonne, and he will give his presentation today about open source in networking. So please go ahead, Jonne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonne, and I shall now share, and if you can tell me if this is visible. It is. Excellent. Thank you very much. Like said, I'm Jonne Soininen. I work in Nokia nowadays as the head of open source initiatives, which includes things on, of course, anything related to open source. So looking at how we use open source, how we contribute to open source, and how we engage to open source communities. And what I'm going to talk to you about a little bit is that how we have had many promises of open source in the past years, and where have we actually gotten with that, and where we are with open source, especially in the networking communities. This is a topic that, of course, many of you are aware of. Open source. Open source has always been part of the networking community, but I have to say that it has grown immensely in the past 6 years. So let's start. So first of all, the promise on open source was, and these are words that I've taken out of the web in articles or in speeches that people have given in different occasions, which is that open source, as software was supposed to eat up the world, open source was supposed to chew up the world, and it is supposed to replace standards and free us from jails. So what is the reality today? Where are we today? And what is open source actually in networking, except of having an interesting dietary habits and somewhat dubious views in incarceration? So let's start. And this is something that I actually start all my open source presentations with, because it's actually many people do not know this or don't consider it this way. So what is open source? Because in the end, open source is basically just software where the source code is made available with a certain license. And the license basically grants, in the license, the copyright holder grants rights for everybody to freely access, use, change, and share software for any purpose. So that means actually that it's just that. It's software with source code available and a license. It doesn't tell actually us how that software was made, who made it, in which groups, and so on. So this is good to understand. When we look at the landscape, especially in telecommunications and in networking, is there is a huge landscape of different open source projects, open source software that are made in different ways. Then some of them are very small. Actually, the thing is basically that there is an one man and a dog that have written that software. It's a library or something like that. Then there are bottom up communities where people have gotten together because they were interested in something and just made software by themselves. Good example of that is, of course, LINX, which just started as people getting together and interested in writing software and writing an operating system. Then there are what I would call top-down communities, which are something that where companies get together and they say, well, this is something that we want to cooperate on. Or there's something that a couple of companies come together and they publish something and ask other people to come along. Good example of those are, for instance, OpenStack or Kubernetes or Open Daylight or ONAP from different angles of the networking world. Then there is software that is open source for sure, and the kind of like but it's something that is organized or controlled by one entity. It is something that you cannot actually contribute to. It's controlled by one company or one party, and but it's still open source. But it's not a community-based open source. So when we talk about open source, we have to take into account a little bit that what is the how that has been put together. Is it something that is driven by a community, and or is it something that is driven by a very small group of people, either individuals or a company? All the things about open source that you heard, especially the positive things, those are usually associated with something that is related to a community, the reviews, an active community fixing bugs, reading, writing documentation, and so on. And those might not always fit. But the thing is, well, it's important to know that there is a lot of open source. They come in big and small, or as XKCD puts it very nicely, you have a modern infrastructure with a lot of software, proprietary and open source, and then there is some little project that everything is relying on that doesn't have that many, that doesn't have that much support from them. And they kind of like, remember to support your open source developers because you might be relying on somebody's personal contribution. But what does it make actually for a project to be successful in open source? And this is, I think, what makes a real difference, this analysis of what open source projects in the end become successful and what not. The first and most important thing is a shared problem. So it's a problem, it's something that where everybody agrees this is a problem and it should be solved. And if people do not have that shared problem, well, it might be a little bit hard to rally people behind it. The second thing is alignment, that the whole industry actually thinks so, or a large group of people, at least, that say, yes, that is a problem, and there should be a solution on that. The second thing is governance, that where you actually solve the problem, that it's something that welcomes different people there, that people feel welcome to come and solve this problem. Now I have it. The other thing is then support. And this means basically that not only that you have the right group in place where everybody feels welcome, you have alignment that people basically think that, well, this is something that is worth solving, and you have a shared problem, but you actually have support that people actually think that this is a problem that they want to solve as well. And they think that this is actually something that they should solve, and they feel responsibility about it. They're willing to support the actual cause and the actual work. The last but not least is also timing. Basically, the thing is that sometimes you have the other stars aligned, but it just isn't the right time. Basically, people think that, well, it is either this problem is not urgent, or the problem has already passed, or the kind of like it's just not cool at this time in the world. And what you want actually there is that either you just don't feel like this is something that where you're willing to invest due to the fact that it isn't hip. And when you look at the different projects against this, you start to get to the kind of like seeing that maybe not all projects will survive, or maybe not all projects are that good. And the thing is there also that when you look at, for instance, in a company's interest to be involved in some of the projects, is also that it needs to be something, and this is part of the support, is that this is non-differentiating for the company. It's not something that where the company thinks, well, this is how I can make my products different, and because that would be not the time where they would, or that would not be a topic where they would actually invest in, or they would not contribute, because they would say, I'd rather keep it because this makes me different. Of course, that differentiation doesn't always mean that that everybody that kind of like though that one company thinks that something is differentiating, if there are enough other people, individuals or companies that think, well, we want to collaborate still on that because it's non-differentiating for us, that is of course something that the open source will still happen. But the correct question is more about, does the industry, or is there enough people that find this non-differentiating for their products? Then we had there was a discussion about this in the past, especially there were presentations in the IETF and in other fora about, well, does open source actually replace standards? And the end result is that, well, open source, that while it has come to the industry, it has actually not replaced standards. It has augmented standards, and it has created a new tool to interoperability as well. Of course, the main point of open source is to do shared R&D together. Basically, people getting together, working on something, and making sure that there is an implementation that everybody can use. So in a way, what it does, it standardizes an implementation. It basically standardizes a single implementation that everybody can use. Standards have a little bit of a different reason to live, which is basically that they standardize interfaces or interoperability between different implementations. And this is also then a good way of seeing that where standards are more strong than open source, or where open source is more strong than standards, is the question is that, is one implementation or few implementations enough, or do you need interoperability between multiple implementations? Do you have different kinds of implementations for different use cases? And this is where, and in the latter part, where you need that kind of interoperability between different implementations, standards are more adapted than open source. Of course, the thing is that standards and open source do not kind of like replace each other, or do not kind of if there are standards that you cannot have open source in that space. We have had that for a long time, that we have implementations, for instance, well, IP is an excellent example of that, where you have an implementation of IP in LINX, for instance, which is completely open source, or in FreeBSD. And then you have proprietary implementations of IP in other products, and they work together. And that's where standards are useful. And that's also that open source can implement standards and do implement standards. So both have a role, and both complement each other. So despite of a kind of like open source getting more prominent in the industry in the last few years, it hasn't actually replaced standards. It has added a new tool in the interoperability toolbox for the industry to use open source in places where standards weren't as strong. So, but how do we see, or how do I see that this moves actually in the future? Because the thing is that we've seen now open source get more prominent in many areas, but we have not seen it necessarily replace everything. I see that shared R&D will increase. We will continue to do more open source. It just makes sense. In the networking area, like in many other areas, open source is really something that what is needed by the industry. The industry uses it a lot now, but also this is something that where we can collaborate much better together in areas of actually writing an implementation, doing something together, which is not only saves us cost, because instead of doing everything alone, you do it with your pals, but it also increases innovation, because in the area where you are not maybe concentrating that much, you get together with other people, and there's then there are more intelligent heads put together, which improves the area very much. The other thing is that what open source is strongly coming and has become in many companies is basically it becomes just part of development. You don't just do open source as an research project or something like that. It's not considered something that is external to your company or to your product development, but it's part of the product development. So when you have an open source portion or your product is based on open source, what do is that you actually do the open source development as part of your normal product development. So you basically your implementation team doesn't just do the software internally, but they do it externally, and they do it externally in the open source first. We call that upstream first or upstream focus, sometimes in the industry. And there the idea is actually that your development team is actually partly external. It's some of your people, but working with other people as well. And the software then comes into your product from the external source. But does that mean that we will only do open source in the future? I don't think so. The differentiation continues. There will be, but there is a place for commercial innovation, and that does complement the open source as well. Already today, many of, for instance, Nokia's products, who I work for, incidentally now, has open source in them. I think all of our products have open source in them, but we still do products which we sell as products to our customers, which have also proprietary, sometimes proprietary innovation. And that will continue to happen as well. Companies will just continue to compete with each other in this matter. So the question is where's my URL? Where is the thing that I actually wanted to, I was promised an URL where I could download a whole network. Can I do that? But that wasn't actually what was promised. This is one of the things about open source, is basically that open source doesn't do products. Open source does software and when it is done in a collaborative manner in a community, it does it very well, and it does it and the software is of good quality and so on. But it doesn't actually promise you products. It's either you or somebody else has to productize that. And the thing is that often is forgotten in open source, it's that the free open source software is actually not free as in free beer, but it's free as in freedom. So you were never promised an URL where you could download your software from. But the thing is that, so where are we actually there? Does this mean that, well, we only have closed source software and closed source products, and because we clearly didn't replace standards, but what did we get? Well, we got quite a bit actually. If you look at these are, by the way, I understand these are eyesores. These are not here to test your vision, but these are here to just illustrate that there is a lot that we use open source now in this industry. One of the main areas for this is the cloud, where we start with OpenStack, Kubernetes, and many of the other projects that we use for cloud are actually open source. There are products that people make out of them, but the basis is open source, and you cannot actually exist in this industry without being active, contributing, and using that open source in your products. So in that area, basically the future that what was promised actually did come as well. Another area which is very rich in open source is artificial intelligence. The thing is basically that if you look at the tools of artificial intelligence and machine learning, those almost all are open source in a way or another. And the landscape of artificial intelligence in open source is huge and growing. And there are a lot of interesting projects there. Some of the solutions that you might see in as products might not be open source, but there isn't a single product, I would claim, that wouldn't use some open source technology in the background. There are a lot of different projects that are used that define open source and write open source for the networking industry. Just to mention a couple of organizations like the OpenStack Foundation or Open Infra Foundation, what it's called now, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, CNCF, the LINX Foundation Networking, where I'm active in, Linux Foundation Edge, Linux Foundation AI and Data. Those are all organizations where cool networking stuff is being done. So, like I said, basically the future is already here. You might not always notice it because basically it's sometimes hidden for you. But the thing is that basically that it is still there, and it is getting more and more prominent as well, and more active. Some of these communities have tens of thousands of people actually in them. So if you look at, for instance, these KubeCon summits that they have had 10,000 people in them. So these are huge things, and they are only getting bigger. And new ones are coming along as well. But also there is the thing that, like I showed you, the three bubble thing, to get a successful open source project, you have to get all stars aligned. So there are also projects that die. So as a summary on this, open source is there and it has an important role, and this role is growing. But it will not replace everything, but it will make everything a little bit better. But the thing is also, and this is maybe a call for action a little bit for the networking community as well, that what I've noticed, so like Nurani said, my background is in the networking area, in the IETF and so on. And I've noticed that these communities, the networking community and the open source community, don't always talk. especially in areas where they should. And it's been a little bit surprising for me. So if we look at, for instance, the cloud native area, the networking knowledge isn't very strong there. So it would be very good of kind of like getting more active networkers there as well. Especially what I was very surprised of when I came 6 years ago to this open source arena, that many of the networking protocols didn't support V6 at that time, because that wasn't just something that was in the wasn't requested from the networking in for instance in OpenStack. I'm happy to see that this has changed and we're getting better support on these things, but it clearly shows that there is a need for the networking communities and the open source communities to get together much more. And I think that there is something that we can learn from both sides. So thank you very much for this. It's been an honor, and I think that we might have some questions.
Thank you so much for that, Jonne. That was a great overview and very informative. I see that there are some questions in the chat, and I have a few questions for you as well. And I'll give people a few minutes to pop any questions you have that you haven't had the chance to ask yet in the Q&A. But I see that Benno Overeinde is it's more of a comment than a question, saying that in DNS there's a model of company, LLC or not-for-profit, that develops open source and accepts community contributions, features, modules, etc. Examples are CZNIC, ISC, NLNetLab, and Power DNS.
Yes, I mean, like like you said, this is more of a comment than a question. Yes, in DNS area, open source has been a big part of that industry for a very long time, and they of course have quite a bit of history in that. Like I said, these are usually projects that are developed by an organization, non-for-profit or not. And but the thing is basically that this shows that there has been a very long history in open source and networking.
Yeah, great. And I know, I mean, it's the same in to some extent in the IX community, and there are route servers and others that are open source that many of the IXPs use. So I wanted to pick up on a few things that you said. So for example, you mentioned that AI is actually one of the areas where open source is being used. Could you explain why that has been an area that is where open source clearly fits the needs?
Well, I think that in AI, for instance, the thing is that what these open source projects are about is they are usually tools, how to use something and how to develop something. And doing these tools together makes a lot of sense. And then you do the application by yourself. That's where you compete. It's the same way that we've had basically, for instance, we have had computer languages that we have done in open source for a very long time, GCC. And I'm like, long time means longer than we actually we have the word or the term open source. And it fits very well when you do tools. It's something that what everybody needs. It makes sense to do it together. And it makes sense to do it in the same, use the same implementation. Of course, there are also, in AI, there are companies that are promoting their, for instance, hardware or something like that, where it makes sense for them to basically then publish their open source code to use their hardware, that people can then, basically it's easier for people to then to get that hardware into use than having proprietary software. So it's used also there as a business tool as well.
Mm-hmm. So I thought it was interesting when you were sharing this slide saying that, talking about these three things need to come together in order for an open source solution to be successful. So code, community, commercial adoption, and then obviously it's also a matter of alignment, support, timing, and governance. So could you give examples of like what are the best examples of where these three things have come together and you know, resulted in successful adoption of open source?
Well, of course, the biggest gorilla in the room is Linux. That's clearly something where all these things have come together, and this is also a good example of that. What I mean about, for instance, non-differentiating. There were companies that clearly thought that doing operating systems was differentiating, and that was their business. So they didn't get to choose this. It was the other people who actually chose that this is something that they want to work together on and actually solve the problem. And originally, those companies who had their proprietary operating systems didn't invest into Linux and weren't participating in that. But many of them do now, and actually they support Linux because it became so big. Other kind of like good examples are, of course, OpenStack in cloud, Kubernetes in cloud native world. And they're also the same thing, is that it just makes sense to work together there rather than building something of your own. The other thing is also that your customers actually ask you for these, rather than, even if you would have your own solution, they say, no, that's actually not what we want, because we want to have the possibility to change vendors. We want to have the compatibility. So use the open source instead. And the other thing is that, which is mind-boggling about many of these technologies, there is so much investment into this that it's just not possible for a single company or single entity just to repeat that. Mm-hmm. That's really the power of the community for you.
Yeah, the crowdsourcing aspect of it. Coming back to what you were saying about Linux, I'll throw in a personal reflection. So my husband, who you know, who is a Mac geek, a diehard Mac geek, because our kids now are getting into gaming, unfortunately, or fortunately, some might say, we've had to install other operating systems on some of the devices. And he recently installed Linux on one of the old Macs and was surprised not by how well it ran and how fast it was, but actually how user-friendly it was. So I think that kind of shows also this thing you were talking about, you know, about the customer needs, actually, that, you know, that in order for a product, whether it's open source or not, to be successful, you need to meet a need at the end of the day. And unless you can kind of adapt and evolve to meet that need, it will not be successful. But clearly they've been very successful there.
Oh, very much so. And the thing is that if we look at Linux what we have been promised a Linux desktop now for 20 years, and it's just a year away. Sounds like some technology in the networking space that has 6 in it. But the thing is basically that, it hasn't quite made the mark yet in the desktop space. But when we look at, for instance, mobile phones, about 80% of them are Linux-based, so Android uses Linux. So there it has made its mark. But the thing is that it fits what the customers need. There is a need for that. But also when we look at the space of Linux desktops, it's hard you have companies that kind of like own the desktop space now, and they are of course not contributing to that. And the people who contribute to that space don't have that much power. And then it takes much longer time to make a good product. And I'm happy to hear that Jared has found Linux and finds it useful. So.
And apologies for outing him in public. So actually, so there are 2 questions that are aligned, both from Neil O'Reilly and Benno. So not just focusing on the success stories. So Benno is saying, thank you, Jonne, a very interesting presentation. Do you have some more examples of successful and anti-example failures of open source project governance?
Well, yeah. So trying to come up with names now, and maybe that's not kind of like doesn't come up now, but there are, I think, basically projects that where you see that the governance is basically, it's one company and they are kind of like hugging it and they're not taking contributions. Well, the thing is that when you feel that, well, your contribution is not valued, or it's made very hard, or you feel that you're actually, it is somebody else just takes it and doesn't does what they want with it, but doesn't kind of like, there isn't a feeling that you get something back through the community. That's where you don't get a lot of contribution. I'm like, we've had, nobody knows these projects' names because they weren't successful. It was something that, for instance, we as a company, a group had just published something, but didn't think about, okay, how to build a community. Well, the community didn't come, and then you didn't get the, you didn't get basically, you didn't get any of the benefits of open source. Yeah, you published it, but that's cool. You can tell your friends in the bar that you published an open source code, but they wouldn't know what the name is because they've never heard about it. And so the community building is something extremely important in this. And there's been many cases where companies have failed in this. The thing is also then, you said there was part to that question that now I forgot, which was the first part. It wasn't just failure due to the community.
More examples of successful and anti-example failures
Yes.
of open source project governance.
Yeah, so that was the governance part. But there is also other thing is basically that there have been a lot of open source projects that have tried to replicate, for instance, telecommunication products. And the telecommunication industry is quite particular in that sense that it needs a lot of investment in the products, and there are not that many vendors in this space. And to be honest, the customer space is not huge either. And there you've seen that somebody has started an open source project, but everybody else that is active in the same space has their own product. And that's when they are not going to contribute to your project. You are all alone in your project, and you are actually doing the same R&D that you would do, that the others are doing privately, just publicly. But it doesn't give you, because there isn't an alignment of the interest, you don't actually get the contribution that you would need.
Interesting. Yeah. So a comment, I guess, a little bit in that vein from Desiree Milosevic. More and more I hear of open source community members are not interested in working on projects if commercial adoption closes the open source code afterwards.
So the thing is that where the open source projects where I'm active, which are community based, you cannot actually close because you don't own the code. The code you have licensed the code and everybody can continue the code, and you're actually part of a community. It's not a product, or it's not a product of one company. But there have been cases of companies who have, and this is the thing, the difference really about a community and a single entity kind of controlled open source, that they basically done the R&D internally. They might take some contribution in, but they haven't built a community around it, and they have kept full control. And then after a while, they notice that they have something unique, and they don't want to give it open source anymore. So they stopped bringing the new versions as open source. And I'm sure that people who are interested in open source and who have kind of like drunken the open source Kool-Aid, and once you do, there's no coming back. The thing is that they don't find that as exciting, because the cool thing is not about publishing code. I'm like, that's not really cool. The cool thing is about working with a community that is excited about the same thing that you are. And this is actually quite interesting, because engineers are generally considered not to be the most outgoing and not the most friendly people, and not very extroverts. And it's what I've seen with the kind of like our engineers that are exactly like that. When you add a little bit of Finnishness to it as well, then you get an extremely closed person. But when people get the exposure to these outside communities and actually working together with other companies and other people from other backgrounds and other parts of the world, it's like a drug. People have a hard time of going back, and people are willing to do all kinds of things just to keep on doing that. And all of a sudden, from a very introvert engineer comes a good open source developer without any problems.
Yeah, it's true. It's amazing to see what people are willing to do with their both the work time and their spare time, and how they're actually willing to contribute to community projects. So you've emphasized this part about community. Do you think that is the key, so to speak, to unlocking the full potential of open source and networking, or what do you see as what are the main challenges, and what do we need to sort of fix or enhance in order to unlock that potential?
Yeah, so kind of like when you look at the different open source projects and what their people that are in those, what they complain about sometimes the tools, and they kind of like, especially now, the fact that you cannot travel, and sometimes before this, the people that their company didn't allow them to travel. But the community is the thing that keeps an open source project together. And you can see that people actually, if some project has started with bad tools or kind of like not enough computer power to run the CI/CD pipelines and so on. When there's a good community, the community comes to rescue and actually helps on that, and the people work together. So the community is very key to this. And actually, now that when I read also Niall O'Reilly's comment here about perhaps counter example, something came to my mind, and this is good because this is a Nokia project. You might remember there was a mobile operating system called Symbian. And in the kind of last ditch to save this operating system, Nokia a long time ago open sourced it. And of course, when a big company that is not that used to open source something, they basically do it in a way that they go like, we're going to open source it, but we're going to keep all the control, which meant, well, you could have not done it. And it was a good example of where we didn't kind of understand what the open sourcing was about and how important the community is. So it's both answer to you about the community, but to also Niall's asking about counter examples.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So Benno has another question. It was triggered by Desiree's comment, and so he was asking, do you also, I guess, see a difference in open source adoption in some companies based on the open source license? So IGBSD3 clause, Apache Public License 2.0, Mozilla Public License 2.0, and GPL 2, GPL 3.
Oh, excellent. I mean, like I was able to go for almost 50 minutes without talking about licenses. That's a really good question. Yes, these are questions that many companies go through. Is basically what kind of license do they support in their, they allow in their products, and many companies have, for instance, they have licenses that they say we just don't want to have that in our products because either we don't understand it completely, or we are just afraid of it. We are worried about some restrictions in the license. And the open source license, basically what I said, it gives you certain rights, but I also what it does, it gives you some restrictions. And for instance, some of these licenses like GPL give restrictions that make you basically, if you use that in your if you use that in your product and you change it, you have to give it downstream. You have to give it to your customer also if they ask that code. So you cannot just change it and keep it to yourself. The other thing is what they have is, well, this joke or kind of like all about copyright, but they have a copy left clause in that, which means that everything that you link to that becomes under that license as well. And that's why many companies are afraid of that. And I have heard about, and I've actually worked in companies who have licensed, who have open sourced something that they didn't want to open source because they weren't careful with this. In our company, in Nokia, we don't have any licenses that we would have forbidden, but we look at case by case that we use these responsibly. What we really do not want to do, and I think this is for most people that use open source, we really do want to be compliant to the open source license, because somebody has given something to us. It's kind of like our duty to make sure that we adhere to that, what they've, under which conditions we have received this. And this is clearly something that is important. But the kind of like licenses, when we look at the kind of like difficult licenses like GPL, well, Linux is GPL. And that is used in the industry a lot. So it's clearly not a problem when it's used appropriately. Telecom industry uses a lot of Apache 2, which is more permissive license. And that is why it's easier for us to understand, and it's easier to explain to our lawyers, which is a big part of open source. Open source is the only type of development where you need more lawyers than developers sometimes. And so I don't know, Benno, if that answered your question, but yes, the licenses have to be taken into account. But if you're careful and you know what you're doing, you don't have to exclude any licenses when you know that what they're used for.
All right. Well, I can't see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A. So I'll give you, might ask you to actually both say a few final words, but also tell us a little bit. So what's the future of open source? If you put on if you look into the crystal ball, what do you think we will see in the coming 10 years?
Yeah, so the future is, I think that it will be using the words of the chairman of or chairperson of the IETF, the future will be very boring because it will become such commonplace. We use it so much and we get to very used to it. So we don't have to have discussions about to use open source or not, or what is the future. I think that it's very bright. It's basically, we will use it more and more in the networking industry. The kind of like power of the community, power of working together is so big. But like I said previously also, it will not replace everything. The differentiation and proprietary competition will continue to be there. But there is a lot of space for open source in this. And I think that we have only scratched the surface. And we will be doing this much more. So, and I'm very excited about that. And
yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, so yeah, please, any final words that you wanted to add as well? I felt like you were about to say some.
Yes, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to say it now or if there was another question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so my final words are just that thank you very much for everybody for attending, and thank you, LINX and Noorani, for asking me to present. I hope this wasn't too boring. A little bit boring is fine. Too boring is not. Boring is not. But the thing is that I hope you got something out of this. I hope that you got a little bit bitten by the open source bug as well, and you get interested in seeing how you can contribute. Especially, like I said, there is a lot of places where networking people could help the open source world, especially in the cloud area, where networking sometimes seems just like a bunch of IP version 4 private addresses and NATs. And the kind of like, it would be good to have fellow networking people getting involved there as well.
Yeah, great to hear. Yeah, thank you very much, Jonne. I see Ulle is also mentioning that maybe it's worth mentioning the hackathons, the IETF hackathons as well. So point people to that as well.
Oh yeah, that is very good, and that is a very good example of where basically standardization and open source working very collaboratively and very constructively together.
Yeah, great. I think from my perspective, I thought it was a very interesting presentation. Knowing you, knowing the subject, I was a little bit disappointed that you didn't bring a programming joke to the play table. I don't know if you have any that you can pull out spontaneously.
Yeah, no, I kind of like thought that bringing myself would be enough of a joke, especially with my Corona comedy beard.
I'll throw one at you and then you can give it a rating, which is one of my favorites. A fool can write a code that a computer can understand. Good programmers write code that they also don't understand after a few days.
That is very good. Thank you, Nurani.
Well, so thank you very much for that interesting presentation, Jonne. I think that was a great overview, but also good insights into the various parts of open source and open source networking. So also thank you to all of you who participated and asked live questions, and those of you watching it afterwards. Please do keep an eye out on the LINX website for upcoming presentations and tutorials. We have some really interesting speakers coming in addition to the one that we've just heard, and we've had some interesting ones in the past as well. So check them out on the LINX website and on the LINX YouTube channel. So with that, I would like to again give a very special thank you to Jonne. Thank you for taking the time to share this really interesting presentation and your immense knowledge in this area. I urge everyone who wants to know more to reach out to Jonne. He is one of the most knowledgeable people in the area, and one of the most well-connected ones, I'd say as well. So he's a good person and a good source to reach out to. It has been a real pleasure listening to your talk, Jonne. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. I don't know who you were talking about, but sounded like a nice person. Most probably not me. Thank you. And
thanks again. Thanks everyone. Be well, stay healthy and safe, and hope to see you all again very soon, and perhaps even in person in one of these conferences. Let's hope for 2021. Thank you all and goodbye.